In the spring of 1973, two men stood at a fence line in Cass County, Iowa, looking out over identical sections of land, 320 acres each. Both parcels of rolling prairie their grandfathers had broken with horse-drawn plows in the 1880s. Both farms sat side by side, separated only by a gravel county road, and that fence line where they met most Sunday mornings to talk about weather, crops, and the eternal challenge of making a living from the soil. One of those men was Robert Sullivan, 43 years old, cautious by nature, widowed 2 years prior when his wife Margaret died of a heart condition at just 41. He farmed with a 1951 Farmall M tractor and a collection of implements that had seen better days but still functioned. The paint was faded, the seat was cracked, the steering wheel had been wrapped 3 times with electrical tape, but the engine ran. The other man was James Carlson, 40 years old, ambitious, confident, a veteran of Vietnam who had come home in 1970, determined to prove that he could build something bigger than what his father had left him. On that particular May morning, James was absolutely convinced he had figured out the secret to modern farming success. But before I tell you what happened between these two men over the next 10 years, before I explain how one of them lost everything while the other survived, you need to understand one thing. This is not a story about farming. This is a story about debt, about pressure, about the deadliest lie ever sold to American agriculture. The lie that you can borrow your way to prosperity. What you are about to hear is true. Every number, every conversation, every decision. I spent 3 months researching this story. I interviewed Robert Sullivan directly. He is 94 years old now, still living on the original farmstead. I reviewed court records. I studied Federal Reserve data. I talked to the pastor who buried 17 farmers during the crisis. And the pattern is undeniable. The farms that failed were the ones that borrowed. The farms that survived had one thing in common: low debt. That is the whole story. It is not complicated. It is not mysterious. High debt plus bad conditions equals failure. Low debt plus bad conditions equals survival. So let me take you back to that fence line in May of 1973. Back to a moment when everything seemed possible and the future looked bright. Back to the last spring before the trap was set. Robert Sullivan woke that Sunday morning at 5:30, same as every day. He made coffee in the percolator that had belonged to his wife. He sat at the kitchen table and wrote in the ledger book his grandfather had started in 1892. Every expense, every sale, every bushel harvested. 3 generations of farming recorded in neat columns. No computers, no spreadsheets, just ink and discipline. He wrote, May 6, 1973, planted 160 acres corn yesterday. Seed cost $412. Fertilizer cost $680. Fuel cost $104. Total invested so far, $12,800. Then he did what he did every Sunday. He calculated how much cash he had in the bank. $8,300. He subtracted what he still needed to spend to finish planting. Herbicide, more fuel, equipment repairs. That would take another $2,000. He would have $6,300 in reserve. Not much, but enough. Enough to survive one bad year. Maybe 2 if he was careful. That was the rule his grandfather had taught his father, and his father had taught him. Always keep enough cash to survive 2 bad years. Because bad years come. They always come. His son Jack came downstairs at 6:15, 17 years old. Tall like his mother, he poured himself orange juice and sat across from his father. How much we got, Dad? $6,000 after we finished planting. Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he said what he had been saying for months. Mr. Carlson has twice that. He told Tyler they are saving $15,000 this year. Robert looked at his son. Tyler was James Carlson's oldest boy, 14 years old. The 2 boys rode the same school bus. Mr. Carlson also owes the bank $85,000. We owe nothing, but he has newer equipment. He gets done faster. He farms more acres. Robert closed the ledger book. He had this conversation with his son at least once a week now. Son, let me tell you something. When your grandfather was your age, it was 1936. The Depression. His father, your great-grandfather, owed $8,000 to the bank. That does not sound like much now, but corn was 40 cents a bushel. It took 20,000 bushels just to pay the interest. Your great-grandfather worked himself to death trying to make those payments. Literally, heart attack in the field. 49 years old. Your grandfather was 16. He took over the farm. He almost lost it. Took him until 1945 to pay off that $8,000. 10 years. And when he finally made the last payment, you know what he did? Jack shook his head. He walked into the bank and he told the president to never contact him again about a loan. He said he would rather farm small and sleep at night than farm big and wake up every morning afraid of the mail. He kept that promise. Never borrowed another dollar. Not for equipment, not for land, not for anything. He paid high bars or he did not buy. That is why we still have this farm. That is why you are sitting here. Jack looked at his plate. He wanted to argue. He wanted to say the world had changed, that farming was different now, that his friends' fathers all had newer equipment and bigger operations. But he could see something in his father's eyes. Not anger, something else. Fear, maybe, or memory. The kind of weight that gets passed down through generations. I'm going to church, Robert said. You coming? Jack nodded. They drove the 6 miles to Riverside Methodist in Robert's 1968 Ford pickup. 200,000 miles, original engine, he maintained it himself, changed the oil every 3,000 miles, greased the fittings, replaced parts as they wore. The truck would last another 10 years if he took care of it, maybe 20. At church, Robert sat in the same pew his family had occupied for 80 years. 3rd row from the front, left side. Pastor David Miller preached about gratitude, about being thankful for what you have instead of envying what your neighbor has. Robert wondered if David knew something, if he had heard the whispers in the community about the men who were borrowing, expanding, buying new equipment. After service, Robert stood outside with the other farmers. They always gathered in the same spot under the elm tree in the parking lot. 11 men, all within 10 years of age, all farming within a 20-mile radius. James Carlson pulled up in a new Chevrolet pickup, 1973 model, bright red, chrome bumpers gleaming. He got out with his wife Karen and their 2 children. Tyler, 14, Amy, 10. Karen wore a new dress. The children had new shoes. James walked over to the group with a smile that could light up a barn. Morning, fellas. Beautiful day. The men nodded. Someone asked about his corn planting. Finished yesterday, James said. 160 acres in 5 days. That new 6-row planter is something else. What used to take me 2 weeks now takes less than 1. One of the other farmers, a man named Dutch Henderson, whistled low. You buy that outright? Financed it. 7-year note, 8% interest. Payment is manageable. Robert stayed quiet. He had learned long ago that silence was often wiser than speech. But he watched James, saw the confidence, the pride, the absolute certainty that he had made the right decision. Another farmer, younger, maybe 35, asked the question Robert knew was coming. You think it is worth it? Going into debt for equipment? James looked around the circle. His eyes stopped on Robert for just a second. Then he answered, I will tell you what I think. I think the world has changed. I think the farmers who refuse to modernize are going to get left behind. You cannot compete with 1950 equipment in 1973. You just cannot. I learned something in Vietnam. You use the best tools available or you lose. Same thing here. This is not your grandfather's farming anymore. This is business, real business. And business requires capital investment. He said it looking straight at Robert. Everyone knew Robert still ran equipment from the 50s. Everyone knew he refused to borrow money. Some admired it. Most thought he was foolish. Robert met James's eyes. He did not look away, but he did not argue either. He simply said, good luck with it, and walked to his truck. On the drive home, Jack spoke up. Why did not you say anything? Say what? That Mr. Carlson is wrong. That debt is bad. You always tell me that. Robert drove for half a mile before answering. Son, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. James Carlson is going to do what he thinks is right. Nothing I say will change his mind, and maybe he is right. Maybe I am the fool. We will know in 5 years. But you do not think he is right. I think he is making a bet. He is betting that prices will stay high, that land values will keep going up, that interest rates will stay low, that weather will cooperate, that nothing will go seriously wrong. Maybe he wins that bet. People do win bets sometimes, but I have never been comfortable gambling with things I cannot afford to lose. They drove the rest of the way in silence. When they pulled into the driveway, Robert saw James Carlson standing at the fence line between their properties, waiting. Robert got out of the truck. He told Jack to go inside and start lunch. Then he walked across the yard to the fence. James stood there with his hands in his pockets. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They just looked out over the fields. The soil was dark and rich, perfect planting conditions, the kind of spring that made a man believe anything was possible. Finally, James spoke. "I did not mean to call you out back there, at church. You did not call me out. Felt like it. Look, Rob, I respect what you do. I respect your grandfather's story. But times have changed. The opportunity right now, the grain prices, the export demand, this is a once-in-a-generation chance. You remember what corn was selling for last year? 210 a bushel. You know what it is trading at right now? 320, $3.20. That is a 50% increase in 12 months. Robert nodded. He knew the numbers. Soviet Union bought 440 million bushels, James continued. Biggest grain purchase in history. Crop failures in China. Currency devaluation. The stars are aligned, and the banks know it. They are practically begging farmers to borrow. Land values are up 20% year over year. If you own land, and you are sitting on equity that is growing faster than any stock market. You could borrow against that, buy more land, double your operation. Could, but will not. James shook his head. Not angry, just disappointed. Why not? Robert looked at the younger man, 40 years old, strong, healthy, full of ambition and dreams. Robert remembered being that age, remembered feeling invincible. That was before Margaret got sick, before he learned that life had a way of destroying certainty. James, can I ask you something? Sure. How much do you owe right now? Total? James hesitated. Money was private. Farmers did not share those details. But something about Robert's tone made him answer. 85,000. The land note from when I bought the place in 70. Equipment notes. Operating line of credit. And what is your payment every year? About 8,500. Robert did math in his head. So you need to clear at least 9,000 just to break even on debt service. That is before you pay yourself. Before you buy food or pay utilities or put tires on your truck. I cleared 40,000 last year. 9,000 is nothing. Last year prices were high. What if they drop? They will not drop. Not with global demand like this. But what if they do? James's jaw tightened. This was the question he did not want to hear. The question that woke him up at 2 in the morning sometimes. The question he pushed away by reminding himself that every expert, every ag economist, every bank officer said the same thing. Prices were going to stay strong. Land values were going to keep appreciating. This was the new normal. Then I will adjust, cut costs, work harder. But I am not going to live in fear of what if. You cannot build anything if you are paralyzed by fear. Robert nodded slowly. You are probably right. I probably am too afraid. My father used to say I had a depression mindset. Maybe that is true. But I will tell you something, James. I sleep well at night. I do not wake up worrying about payments. I do not check the mail afraid of past due notices. And if prices drop tomorrow, or if we have a drought, or if something breaks, I will survive. Will you? James did not answer. He looked at Robert for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his house. Robert stood at the fence line alone. He thought about his grandfather's ledger, about the entries from 1931 and 32 and 33, the years when income barely covered seed costs, the years when they ate potatoes and corn 3 meals a day because there was no money for anything else, the years when the bank sent letters every month threatening foreclosure. His grandfather had written something in the margin of the ledger on December 15, 1933. Robert had memorized it. Today I made the interest payment, $400. We have $38 left for the winter. I do not know how we will make it to spring, but I know one thing. If God lets us survive this, I will never owe another man a dollar as long as I live. The freedom of owing nothing is worth more than all the land in Iowa. Robert walked back to his house. Jack had made sandwiches. They ate together at the kitchen table. Through the window, Robert could see James Carlson's new pickup parked in his driveway, chrome shining in the afternoon sun. That night, Robert sat at the same table with his ledger open. He did something he rarely did. He calculated what his operation would look like if he followed James's advice, if he borrowed money, bought new equipment, expanded. He started with equipment, a new tractor like the one James had mentioned. John Deere 4430. The dealer price was $54,000. Financed over 7 years at 8.5%, that would be a payment of about $900 a month, $10,800 a year. Then land. If he bought 160 acres at current market prices, $1,600 an acre, that was $256,000. He could put down 20%, $51,000. More than 6 years of profit. He would have to borrow $205,000. At 8% over 20 years, that payment would be $20,800 a year. Total annual debt service, $31,600. He stared at the number, $31,600. Every year for 7 years on the equipment, for 20 years on the land. He tried to imagine making that payment, month after month, year after year, rain or shine, good prices or bad, healthy or sick. Then he did something else. He calculated how many bushels of corn he would need to sell just to cover that debt payment. At current prices of $3.20 a bushel, he would need to harvest and sell 9,875 bushels just to make the payment, not to pay for seed or fertilizer or fuel or repairs or taxes or living expenses, just to service the debt. 9,875 bushels. On 480 acres, he would need to average 123 bushels per acre after all costs just to break even on payments. That left no room for error. A wet spring that delayed planting, a dry summer that stressed the crop, an early frost. Any of those could drop yields below that threshold. And what if prices dropped? At $2 a bushel, he would need to sell 15,800 bushels just to make the payment. At 175, which is where prices had been 5 years ago, he would need almost 18,000 bushels. Robert closed the ledger. His hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, from something else. Recognition, maybe. He recognized the trap. He could see it so clearly. The banks were offering money to farmers at a moment when everything looked perfect. High prices, good weather, rising land values. It was easy to believe it would last forever. Easy to think you were being smart by leveraging your assets. But debt was not a tool. Debt was a commitment, a promise to pay regardless of circumstances. And farming was nothing but circumstances. Weather you could not control, prices you could not predict, equipment that broke at the worst possible times. A farmer with no debt had flexibility. A farmer with debt had an anchor chained to his leg, and the only question was whether the water would rise high enough to drown him. Robert opened the ledger one more time. He turned to a blank page. At the top he wrote, May 6, 1973. Below that he wrote, James Carlson thinks I am a fool for not borrowing. Maybe he is right. Maybe I am passing up the opportunity of a lifetime. But I have made my decision. I will not borrow money I cannot pay back in one harvest. I will not bet this farm on assumptions about the future. I will not trade the freedom of owing nothing for the slavery of monthly payments. If I am wrong, I will farm small and die small, but I will die free. If James is wrong, he will lose everything. Time will tell which of us chose wisely. He dated it, signed it, closed the book. Through the window, he could see lights on in the Carlson house. He wondered if James was doing the same thing, running numbers, calculating, planning his expansion. Robert said a short prayer, not for himself, for James, for all the farmers in the county who were being sold the dream of borrowed prosperity. Then he went to bed. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in late May, Robert was in his machine shed rebuilding the carburetor on his Farmall M when he heard a truck pull into his driveway. He walked outside wiping his hands on a rag. It was Roger Whitman, the president of First National Bank of Riverside. Roger was 58 years old, broad-shouldered, silver hair. He wore a suit even though he was driving through farmland. He got out of a Lincoln Continental and extended his hand. Rob, good to see you. They shook. Robert waited. Bankers did not make house calls unless they wanted something. Got a minute to talk? Robert gestured toward 2 metal chairs under the machine shed overhang. They sat. Roger got straight to it. I am visiting all the established farmers in the county. Wanted to let you know about some opportunities we are offering. You have probably heard that land values are up significantly. Grain prices are strong. We are in a very good position right now. And the bank wants to help farmers like you take advantage. Robert said nothing. You own your land free and clear, Roger continued. 320 acres worth roughly $448,000 at current market rates. That is tremendous equity. You could borrow against that. Buy another 160 acres, maybe 240. Double your operation. With new equipment and more land, you could be grossing 200,000 a year easy. Robert looked at the banker. He had known Roger for 20 years. Roger had 3 children in college, 2 of them at private universities. Roger drove a new Lincoln every 2 years. Roger belonged to the country club. Roger lived in a world where debt was normal, expected, smart. Roger, can I ask you something? Of course. If I borrow $200,000 and land prices drop, who loses money? Roger smiled, a patient smile, the smile of a man who had heard this question before. Land prices do not drop, Rob. I have been in banking for 32 years. Land values have increased every single year. It is the safest investment in America. Safer than stocks, safer than bonds. You cannot print more land. Population keeps growing. Food demand keeps growing. Land values will continue to appreciate. But if they did drop, hypothetically, who loses? Roger's smile faded slightly. Well, you would have less equity, but you would still own the land. You would still be farming. And if I could not make the payments, then we would work something out. Refinance, restructure. And if we could not work something out, Roger shifted in his chair. Rob, I did not come here to talk about worst-case scenarios. I came to talk about opportunity. You are sitting on a gold mine. You are leaving money on the table. Every year you do not expand is a year of lost income. Robert nodded slowly. Roger, I appreciate you coming out. I really do, but I am not interested in borrowing. Not even for equipment. You are running a tractor from the 50s. You could trade that in, get something modern, cut your hours in half. I like my hours. Roger stood up. He was not angry, just disappointed. He had a quota to meet. The bank's board of directors had made it clear. Agricultural lending was the growth sector. They needed to get more money out into the farm community. The more loans they made, the more interest they collected. And with land values rising, the collateral was solid. It was almost risk-free. Well, if you change your mind, you know where to find me. I do. Thank you, Roger. They shook hands again. Roger walked to his Lincoln. Before he got in, he turned back. You know James Carlson is borrowing to expand, right? I heard something about that. Smart move. He will be farming 480 acres by fall. You stay at 320, you will be the small guy. In 10 years, operations like yours will not be viable. You will get priced out. Economies of scale, Rob. That is the future. Maybe so. Roger drove away. Robert stood in the driveway watching the dust settle. He thought about what Roger had said, about being priced out, about becoming non-viable, about the future belonging to the big operations. Maybe it was true. Maybe in 10 years he would look back and realize he had made a terrible mistake, that he should have borrowed when he had the chance, that his fear had cost him everything. Or maybe in 10 years he would still be here, still farming, still free. He walked back into the machine shed. He picked up the carburetor he had been rebuilding. It was tedious work, cleaning tiny jets, replacing gaskets, setting adjustments with a feeler gauge. But when he was done, the tractor would run better, use less fuel, last longer. Slow and steady. That was his way. It had been his grandfather's way. It would be his son's way if Jack chose to stay. That evening, as the sun was setting, Robert walked out to the fence line. From there, he could see both farms, his and James's. They looked almost identical. Same soil, same crops, same potential. But underneath, they were completely different. One built on equity, one built on debt. One could weather a storm, one could not. Robert wondered how long it would be before they found out which approach was right. He did not know that the answer would come faster than he imagined. He did not know that within 36 months, the Federal Reserve would change everything. That interest rates would double, that grain prices would collapse, that land values would crater. He did not know that he was looking at James Carlson's farm for one of the last times while it still belonged to James. All he knew was this: he had made his choice. He would live with it, and whatever happened, he would be able to look his son in the eye and say he had done what he thought was right. The sun dropped below the horizon. The fields turned dark. Robert walked back to his house. Inside, Jack was doing homework at the kitchen table. Robert sat down across from him. Son, someday you are going to own this farm. And when you do, you are going to face the same choice I faced. Someone is going to offer you money. They are going to make it sound smart, safe. They are going to tell you that everyone else is doing it, and you are going to have to decide. Jack looked up from his textbook. What should I do? Robert thought about his answer for a long time. Finally, he said, whatever you decide, make sure you can sleep at night. Make sure you are not making a decision because you are afraid of what other people think. Make sure you understand that debt is not just a number on paper. It is a weight you carry every single day. And sometimes that weight is too heavy. Jack nodded. He did not fully understand. He was only 17. But someday he would. Someday he would remember this conversation and know what his father meant. Robert opened his grandfather's ledger one more time. He turned to the last page his grandfather had written. March 4th, 1961, the day before his grandfather died. The handwriting was shaky. The old man had been 83 years old, dying of cancer, barely able to hold a pen. But he had written something, his last words committed to paper. I have lived 83 years. I have farmed for 67 of them. I have seen good times and bad. I have seen men get rich and men lose everything. And I have learned one thing above all else. A man who owes nothing can survive anything. A man who owes everything can survive nothing. Choose which man you want to be. Robert read those words aloud to his son. Then he closed the book. He put it back on the shelf where it had sat for 12 years, where it would sit for 12 more, where it would sit long after Robert was gone, a testament to 3 generations of men who understood that freedom mattered more than size, that survival mattered more than growth, that owing nothing was worth more than owning everything. Outside in the darkness, the land waited. 320 acres of Iowa prairie, paid for, free and clear. It had survived the Depression. It had survived droughts and floods and locusts and hard times. It would survive whatever came next, because it belonged to a man who understood the one truth that James Carlson had not yet learned. In farming, as in life, it is not about how much you have. It is about how much you owe. And the less you owe, the more you truly own. The fence line between the 2 farms stood silent in the night. On one side, a man who had chosen security. On the other, a man who had chosen ambition. Neither knew that within 5 years, one of those choices would lead to prosperity and peace. The other would lead to bankruptcy and ruin. The only question was which would be which. And time, as it always does, would provide the answer. The summer of 1973 was perfect. Not good. Perfect. The kind of summer that makes farmers forget that weather can be cruel, that markets can turn, that nothing in agriculture is guaranteed except uncertainty. June brought gentle rains, just enough to germinate the seed, not enough to drown the roots. July was warm but not scorching. The corn grew tall and straight, reaching for the sun like green hands grasping at heaven. August delivered more rain at exactly the right time, filling out the ears, swelling the kernels. Robert Sullivan walked his fields every evening after dinner. It was a ritual his grandfather had taught him. You cannot manage what you do not observe. He would pull random ears, peel back the husks, examine the kernels, count the rows, feel the moisture. This year the ears were heavy, 18 rows of kernels. Some had 20. The cobs were thick as a man's forearm. Standing in the middle of his field on an August evening, watching the sun paint the sky orange and purple, Robert allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This was going to be a good year, maybe a great year. He estimated 122 bushels per acre. On 320 acres, that would be 39,040 bushels. At $3.20 per bushel, if prices held, that was $125,000 gross revenue. He did the math in his head as he walked back to the house. Seed, fertilizer, herbicide, fuel, equipment maintenance, property taxes, insurance. Total operating costs would run about $36,000. That left $89,000. Clear profit, no debt to service, no payments to make, just $89,000 that belonged to him and his son. But Robert did not celebrate. He had lived through enough harvests to know that gross revenue and net income were 2 different things. Equipment broke, prices changed, something always ate into the profit. So he kept his expectations modest. If he cleared $70,000, he would be satisfied. If he cleared $80,000, he would be grateful. If he cleared $90,000, he would put half of it in the bank for the inevitable bad year. Across the fence line, James Carlson was having similar thoughts. But his numbers were different. He had planted 480 acres. His new 6-row planter had allowed him to finish in record time, and he had gotten the seed in the ground during perfect conditions. His corn looked even better than Robert's. He was estimating 128 bushels per acre. 480 acres times 128 bushels. 61,440 bushels. At $3.20 per bushel, that was $196,612 gross. James sat at his kitchen table after his family had gone to bed, working the numbers on a yellow legal pad. His operating costs were higher than Robert's. More acres meant more seed, more fertilizer, more chemicals, more fuel. He estimated $68,000 in total costs. That left $128,612. From that, he had to subtract his debt service. The land payment was $20,800. The equipment payment was $12,600. Total debt service, $33,400. $128,612 minus $33,400. Net income, $95,212. James stared at that number. $95,000. More than his father had ever made in a single year. More than he had imagined possible when he came home from Vietnam. He had been right. The expansion had been the correct decision. The debt was manageable. He was building something. He walked outside and stood in his driveway looking at his new pickup truck. The chrome gleamed under the yard light. Beyond it, in the machine shed, sat his John Deere 4430. Clean, powerful, modern. The pride of ownership swelled in his chest. This was what success looked like. This was what it meant to be a modern farmer. Not clinging to old equipment in old ways like Robert Sullivan. Moving forward, taking calculated risks, using leverage to multiply opportunity. James went back inside and climbed into bed next to Karen. She stirred slightly. "You okay?" "Better than okay. This is going to be our best year ever." She smiled in the darkness and went back to sleep. James lay there thinking about what he would do with $95,000. He would pay down some debt. Maybe take the family on a real vacation. Disney World. The kids would love that. He had promised Tyler they would go someday. This year, he could actually keep that promise. Sleep came easy that night. Tomorrow, he would start making preparations for harvest. Life was good. Harvest came in late September. Robert rented a combine from a neighbor for $800. It was a 1968 model, nothing fancy, but it picked clean and the grain bin worked fine. He harvested his 320 acres in 6 days. His yield estimate had been close, 122 bushels per acre, 39,040 bushels total. He sold half of it immediately at $3.15 per bushel. Prices had dipped slightly from the summer highs, but they were still strong. That sale brought in $61,541. He kept the other half in his grain bins to sell later. Sometimes prices went up in winter when supplies tightened. Sometimes they went down, but selling half at harvest protected him from getting caught if prices collapsed. It was another rule his grandfather had taught him. Never sell everything at once. Never hold everything hoping for better prices. James harvested in 4 days with a newer combine he had rented. His yields were even better than expected, 130 bushels per acre, 62,400 bushels total. He sold 3/4 of it at $3.15. That sale brought in $147,420. By the end of October, both men had deposited their harvest checks. Both felt vindicated. Both believed they had made the right choices. But neither of them knew what was happening in banks across Iowa. Neither of them understood that they were living through a moment that would be studied by economists for decades. A moment when easy credit and high commodity prices created a perfect illusion. The illusion that farming had fundamentally changed. That the old rules no longer applied. That debt was not dangerous if you used it wisely. On the first Saturday in November, the Riverside community held its annual harvest festival. It was a tradition that went back to the founding of the town. Farmers gathered in the high school gymnasium for a potluck dinner. Tables groaned under the weight of casseroles and pez. Children ran between the chairs playing tag. Men stood in clusters talking about yields and prices and the winter wheat planting. Roger Whitman, the banker, stood on a small stage at one end of the gym. He tapped a microphone. "Can I have your attention, please, just for a minute?" The room quieted. Roger smiled. "I want to thank you all for another successful year. As most of you know, First National Bank has been serving this community for 82 years. And I can tell you, without exaggeration, that this has been one of the best years in our history. Grain prices are strong, land values are up, the agricultural economy is booming, and we want to continue supporting that growth. He paused for effect. Starting Monday, we are launching a new program, agricultural expansion loans at preferential rates, 7.5% fixed for the first 3 years. We are committed to helping farmers in this community grow their operations. If you have been thinking about buying more land, upgrading equipment, or expanding in any way, come talk to us. We want to be your partner in success. Buzz. Applause filled the gym. Roger stepped down from the stage and was immediately surrounded by farmers asking questions. Robert sat at a table in the corner with Jack. He watched the scene with something close to disbelief. The bank was actively encouraging farmers to borrow, not just approving loans for those who asked, actively recruiting borrowers, offering preferential rates, making it sound like a moral imperative to expand. He leaned toward his son. You see what is happening here? Jack looked confused. The bank is offering good rates. The bank is selling debt like a used car salesman sells cars. They are making it sound like borrowing money is the smart thing to do, the responsible thing. They are creating urgency, fear of missing out. But Mr. Whitman said land values are up. If you borrow now and values keep going up, you build equity. Robert set down his fork. Son, let me tell you something about banks. They do not make money when you succeed. They make money when you borrow. Every dollar you borrow, they collect interest. They do not care if land values go up or down. They have collateral. If you cannot pay, they foreclose and sell the land. They get their money either way. The only person taking real risk is the borrower. So you think Mr. Whitman is lying? Number one, I think he believes what he is saying. I think everyone here believes it. But belief does not change reality. Land values going up is not a law of nature. It is a market condition. Markets change, they always change. Across the room, James Carlson stood with a group of younger farmers. They were all talking excitedly about the new loan program. One of them, a man named Gary Peterson, had already decided to borrow $150,000 to buy an adjoining quarter section. You should do it too, Gary said to James. You are already set up for 480. Buy another 160 and you will be at 640. Economies of scale really kick in at that level. James was tempted. He had been thinking about it. With corn at $3, 640 acres could gross $260,000. Even with higher costs, he could clear over $100,000 after debt service. But something held him back. Maybe it was the memory of Robert Sullivan's question at the fence line. What if prices drop? Maybe it was the weight of the debt he already carried. $33,000 a year felt manageable. Adding another $20,000 in land payments would push his total debt service to over $50,000. That was a lot of corn. I will think about it, James said, but I am not making any decisions tonight. Gary laughed. Think fast. Land is not getting cheaper. This time next year, that quarter section will cost you $50,000 more. James nodded but said nothing. He looked across the gym and saw Robert sitting with Jack. The old man caught his eye. Robert raised his coffee cup in a slight gesture. Not quite a toast, just an acknowledgement. Two men who had chosen different paths, both trying to make sense of a world that seemed to be changing faster than either of them could process. The festival ended near midnight. Families drove home under a clear November sky. The stars were brilliant. The air was cold. Winter was coming. But for now, in the space between harvest and the hard months ahead, there was peace. Robert and Jack drove home in comfortable silence. When they pulled into the driveway, Robert sat for a moment before turning off the truck. You think I am wrong about the borrowing? Jack considered the question carefully. I do not know, Dad. Everyone else is doing it. Mr. Carlson, Mr. Peterson, even Mr. Henderson took out a loan last spring. They cannot all be wrong. That is what people said in 1929, right before the stock market crashed. Everyone was buying on margin. Everyone was making money. Then it all fell apart. The people who survived were the ones who owned their stocks outright, the ones with no debt. But this is different. This is farming. People always need food. They do. But that does not mean they can pay high prices. And it does not mean the government will not change policies, or that weather will cooperate, or that some new disease will not wipe out crops. There are 1,000 things that can go wrong. And when you have debt, you cannot absorb those shocks. So what do? We keep doing what we have been doing. We farm our 320 acres. We pay cash for everything. We save money. and we watch what happens to everyone else. It was not the answer Jack wanted. He was 17 years old. He wanted excitement, growth, the feeling of building something big. But he trusted his father, so he nodded and they went inside. Winter passed. Spring came again. 1974 began with optimism across the Midwest. Corn prices had held through the winter. Land values continued to climb. The banks continued to lend, and farmers continued to borrow. By April, 7 of the 11 farmers who had stood under the elm tree at church were carrying significant new debt. They had bought land or equipment or both. The consensus was clear. This was the opportunity. This was the time to expand. Robert planted his 320 acres same as always. Farm All M pulling the same 4-row planter he had used for 15 years. It took him 12 days. James planted his 480 acres in 6 days with his 6-row planter and 4430 tractor. The efficiency difference was undeniable. One evening in May, James stopped by Robert's place. He found the older man in the machine shed replacing the clutch on the Farm All. Got a minute? Robert straightened up, wiping grease from his hands. Always, what is on your mind? James hesitated. Then he said what he had been thinking for weeks. You ever worry you are missing out? I mean, look at you. You are breaking your back on equipment that is older than I am. Meanwhile, I am sitting in an air-conditioned cab listening to the radio. I am done planting in half the time. I can work longer hours because I am not exhausted. And my yields are better because I can plant faster and hit optimal windows. Robert leaned against the workbench. Your yields better because of the tractor or because you are a good farmer? Both maybe, but the tractor helps, no doubt. So does an air-conditioned cab, so does a radio. But James, can I ask you something? How much time did you save with that tractor? 6 days, like I said. And what did you do with those 6 days? James thought about it. I spent time with the kids, fixed some fence, caught up on maintenance. All good things. Worth $12,000 a year? James's face hardened. It is not just about time. It is about keeping up. You think you can compete long-term with 1950 equipment? Compete with who? You? We are not competing. We are neighbors. We both grow corn. We both sell it. There is no competition. You know what I mean? The industry is changing. Small operations will not survive. Robert picked up a wrench and turned back to the tractor. Maybe you are right, or maybe the big operations will not survive. Time will tell. James stood there for another moment, wanting to say more, wanting to convince Robert that he was making a mistake. But he knew it was pointless. Robert Sullivan was not going to change. He was going to keep farming the same way he always had until the day he died or the day he could not physically do it anymore. Suit yourself, James said, and walked back to his truck. Robert watched him go. Then he returned to the clutch replacement. The work was hard. His hands were stiff. His back ached. But he was not paying $900 a month for a tractor. He was not worried about interest rates or payment schedules. When he finished this repair, the Farm All would run for another 5 years. Slow and steady. That was his way. The summer of 1974 was almost as good as 73. Good rains, warm temperatures, healthy crops. Robert's fields looked strong. James's fields looked stronger. But something had changed in the broader economy. Something subtle that most farmers did not notice because they were focused on their crops and their immediate circumstances. The Federal Reserve had started to worry about inflation. Consumer prices were rising. The oil crisis was pushing up energy costs, and the Fed's traditional response to inflation was to raise interest rates. In June, the prime rate ticked up from 6% to 6.5%. Not a huge jump, but enough to change the math for anyone with variable rate debt. James Carlson's land loan had a variable rate tied to prime. When prime went up, his rate went up. His monthly payment increased by $48. Not enough to cause panic, just enough to notice. He mentioned it to Karen one night at dinner. The land payment went up a little. How much? $48 a month, about $580 a year. Can we afford it? We will be fine. Crop looks good, prices are holding. But Karen noticed something in his voice. A slight edge. The first hint of worry. She did not push. They had been married 12 years. She knew when to ask questions and when to stay quiet. Robert noticed the interest rate change too. Not because it affected him. He had no debt. But because he read the agriculture reports in the weekly newspaper. He saw the Fed statements. He understood what they meant. Rising interest rates were the beginning of the end of easy money. The Fed was trying to cool the economy, And when they did that, they used interest rates as a brake. Higher rates meant higher borrowing costs. Higher borrowing costs meant less lending. Less lending meant less money chasing land and equipment. Less money meant prices stabilized or fell. It was basic economics. Robert had never gone to college, but he understood cause and effect. He said nothing to anyone, not even to Jack, but he started keeping closer track of interest rate changes. He clipped articles from the newspaper and filed them in a folder. He wanted to understand what was happening, because understanding was the first step to preparation. Harvest 1974 came in strong. Robert averaged 118 bushels per acre, a bit lower than 73, but still good. He sold half his crop at $2.85 per bushel. Prices had dipped from the highs, but they were still historically strong. His gross revenue was $109,440. After costs, he netted $74,000. He put $40,000 in the bank, kept $20,000 for living expenses, spent $14,000 on a used grain truck and some equipment repairs. James averaged 125 bushels per acre on his 480 acres. 60,000 bushels total. He sold 3/4 of it at $285. Gross revenue, $171,000. Costs, $66,000. Debt service, $33,980. Net, $71,020. On paper, both men had done well. Robert had netted slightly more because he had no debt, but James had farmed 50% more land. His total revenue was higher. His operation was bigger. To most observers, James was the success story. On the first Sunday in December, Robert sat in church listening to Pastor David Miller preach about gratitude, about being thankful in all circumstances, about trusting in God rather than material wealth. After the service, the farmers gathered under the elm tree as always. The mood was celebratory. It had been 2 good years in a row. Men were talking about buying new pickups, taking vacations, sending kids to college. Roger Whitman pulled up in his Lincoln and got out. He had not come for the service. He had come for the farmers. He walked over to the group with a smile. "Gentlemen, I hope you all had a blessed harvest. I wanted to let you know, we still have funds available for expansion loans. Same rate as before. 7.5% fixed for 3 years. Several of your neighbors have already taken advantage. I would hate for anyone to miss out." One of the younger farmers, a man named Tom Drescher, spoke up. "I heard prime rate went up. Does that affect your rates?" Roger shook his head. "Not on new loans. We are holding at 7.5 for qualified borrowers. But that offer expires end of year. After January 1st, rates will adjust to reflect market conditions." It was a sales tactic, create urgency, make people feel like they had to act now or lose the opportunity. Robert watched the faces of the men around him. He saw the internal calculations, the temptation, the fear of missing out. Gary Peterson was the first to speak. "I will come in Monday. I have been looking at another quarter section." Roger shook his hand. "Excellent. Let's make it happen." 2 other farmers also committed. Roger wrote their names in a small notebook. "Anyone else? This is a limited time offer, gentlemen." James Carlson stood silent. He was tempted. God, he was tempted. 640 acres, maybe even 800. He could be one of the biggest operations in the county. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the look on Robert Sullivan's face. Robert was watching the whole scene with an expression that was hard to read. Not judgment exactly, something else. Sadness, maybe. James caught Robert's eye. Robert gave the slightest shake of his head, so subtle that no one else noticed. But James saw it. "Not today, Roger," James said, "but thanks." Roger looked disappointed but nodded. "Well, the offer stands until December 31st. After the banker left, the group began to break up. James walked over to where Robert stood. "You think I am making a mistake? Not expanding?" Robert looked at the younger man for a long moment. "I think you already have more debt than I would be comfortable with. But that is just me. You have to make your own decisions. Prime rate is up. If it keeps going up, my payments could get expensive." They could. "So what would you do?" Robert chose his words carefully. "If it were me, I would focus on paying down what I already owe. I would not take on more debt until the market stabilizes. But James, I am not you. I am old and cautious. Maybe too cautious. You are young and bold. The world probably needs both kinds of men." James nodded slowly. He appreciated Robert's honesty, even if he did not fully agree with it. They walked to their trucks. The December sun was weak and pale. Winter was settling in. The fields were brown and dormant. In a few months, they would plant again. The cycle would continue, but something had shifted. Something neither man could quite name. A sense that the easy times were ending, that harder days were coming. Robert drove home with Jack. They did not talk about the conversation at church. They did not need to. Jack had heard everything. He was learning, watching, absorbing the lessons his father taught not through lectures, but through example. That night, Robert opened his ledger. He wrote the date, December 8th, 1974. Below that, he wrote, 2 good years, but the signs are changing. Interest rates rising, Fed tightening. I believe we are near a peak. The next few years will separate the survivors from the failures. I am grateful to have no debt. I am prepared for what comes next. He closed the book and went to bed. Across the fence line, in a house with lights still burning, James Carlson sat at his kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills. His loan payment had increased again. Another small bump, nothing catastrophic, but enough to make him uneasy. He ran the numbers one more time. If corn stayed at $2.85, he would be fine. If it dropped to $2.50, he would be tight but manageable. If it dropped below $2, he would be in trouble. But corn would not drop below $2. Everyone said so. The experts, the economists, the bank officers. Global demand was strong. This was the new normal. James told himself that 3 times before he turned out the light and went to bed. Outside, the Iowa winter settled over both farms. The land rested, the snow fell, and deep in the earth, in the halls of the Federal Reserve, men in suits were making decisions that would change everything. They were raising rates again, aggressively. They were determined to break inflation, and they did not care what it cost. The trap was set. The spring was loaded. All it would take was one bad year, one price drop, one drought, and the men who had borrowed believing the good times would last forever would find themselves caught in a vice with no way out. Robert Sullivan knew it was coming. He could feel it the way a farmer feels a storm before it arrives. The pressure changing, the wind shifting. He was ready. He had no debt. He had cash reserves. He had equipment that was paid for and functional. James Carlson did not know it was coming. He believed in progress, in growth, in the future. And that belief, that confidence, that optimism would cost him everything. The fence line stood between them. On one side, a man who would survive. On the other side, a man who would lose it all. The only question was when. The winter of 1975 began with hope and ended with the first cracks in the foundation. Not visible cracks, not the kind you could see from the road or notice in casual conversation, but the kind that structural engineers know are the most dangerous. The ones that run deep, the ones that compromise everything. In January, the Federal Reserve raised the prime rate to 7%. In February, 7.5%. By March, 8%. Each increase was announced in dry language buried in the financial section of newspapers. Most farmers never saw the announcements. They were too busy preparing for spring planting, too focused on equipment maintenance and seed orders and the million small details that consumed a farmer's attention. But Robert Sullivan saw them. He clipped each announcement and filed it in his folder. He kept a handwritten chart on a piece of graph paper tracking the rate increases month by month. The line went up at an angle that made his stomach tight, 8%. That meant James Carlson's land payment had increased from $20,800 to over $23,000. His equipment payment had also adjusted upward. Total debt service was now approaching $37,000 a year. Robert did the math. At $2.85 per bushel, James needed to sell 13,000 bushels just to cover debt payments. On 480 acres, that meant he needed to average at least 27 bushels per acre just to break even on debt. Before operating costs, before feeding his family, before anything. The margin for error was shrinking, and the year had not even started yet. Robert said nothing. It was not his place to warn a neighbor about financial decisions already made, but he watched, and he worried. Spring planting went smoothly for both men. April brought good moisture. May was warm. The corn germinated and emerged on schedule. By early June, both farms had healthy stands of young corn reaching toward the sun. But in the grain markets, something had changed. The Soviet Union, which had driven prices to record highs in 73 and 74, announced they had achieved a record harvest. They would not need to import American grain. China also reported strong domestic production. Global supply was increasing. Demand was flattening. Corn futures began to drift downward. $3 became $2.90. $2.90 became $2.75. By July, futures for fall delivery were trading at $2.60. Robert watched the prices with the calm of a man who had no debt. A 25-cent drop in corn prices meant he would make $8,000 less than the previous year. Significant, but not catastrophic. He would still be profitable. He would still sleep at night. James watched the same prices with growing anxiety. A 25-cent drop meant $15,000 less revenue. That would cut his net income almost in half. He would still be profitable. Barely. But the cushion was gone. The room for error had evaporated. He sat at his kitchen table one evening in late July with his legal pad and calculator. Karen was putting the children to bed. The house was quiet except for the sound of his pen scratching numbers. 480 acres, assuming 125 bushels per acre average. 60,000 bushels total. At $2.60 per bushel, that was $156,000 gross revenue. Operating costs had increased. Fertilizer prices were up. Fuel was up because of the ongoing energy crisis. Herbicides were up. He estimated $70,000 in total operating costs. Gross revenue, $156,000. Minus cost, $70,000, equals $86,000. Minus debt service, $37,000. Net income, $49,000. He stared at that number. $49,000. Last year, he had netted $71,000. The year before, $95,000. He was going backward. But it was just 1 year. Prices would recover. They always did. This was temporary. He told himself that 3 times while he sat there in the kitchen. Then Karen came in and saw his face. What is wrong? Nothing. Just running numbers. She sat down across from him. After 12 years of marriage, she knew when he was lying. Tell me. He showed her the legal pad. She looked at the numbers without fully understanding them. She had grown up in town. Her father owned a hardware store. She did not know farming math. Is $49,000 bad? It is less than half what we made 2 years ago. But we will be okay? We will be fine. It is just 1 year. She wanted to believe him. So she did. She stood up and kissed the top of his head. You always figure it out. After she went to bed, James sat alone in the dark. Through the window, he could see the yard light at Robert Sullivan's place. A single bulb illuminating the old Farmall M parked under a pole shed. That tractor was worth maybe $3,000. His John Deere 4430 was worth $40,000. His operation was modern, efficient, better. So why did he feel like the one in danger? August brought the heat, day after day of 95-degree temperatures and cloudless skies. The corn needed rain, rain that did not come. By mid-August, the leaves were curling. The stalks were stressed. Robert walked his fields every evening and saw the damage. This was not going to be a good year. He revised his estimates downward, 110 bushels per acre, maybe less. James saw the same stress in his fields. He had invested heavily in irrigation equipment the previous year, but even irrigation could not fully compensate for this kind of heat. He revised his estimates to 115 bushels per acre. Then in late August, the rains finally came. Too late to save the crop, but enough to cause a different problem. Fungal diseases exploded in the humid conditions after the drought. Gray leaf spot, northern cornleaf blight. The diseases spread rapidly through fields that were already stressed. Robert sprayed fungicide on the worst affected areas. It cost him $1,200, money he had not budgeted, but necessary. James sprayed his entire 480 acres. It cost him $4,800, money he did not have. He called Roger Whitman at the bank. I need to increase my operating line of credit. How much? $5,000. Roger was quiet for a moment. James, your operating line is already at $22,000. That is above what we normally allow for your size operation. I know, but I have to spray. If I do not, I will lose yield. What is your projected yield? 105 bushels per acre now, maybe less. Roger did some quick math in his head. 105 bushels times 480 acres times 260 per bushel. That was 130,000 gross, minus 70,000 costs, 60,000 net, minus 37,000 debt service, 23,000 net income. That was tight, very tight. I can approve 5,000, Roger said. But James, we need to talk about your overall debt load. Can you come in next week? Sure, thanks, Roger. James hung up the phone feeling like he had dodged a bullet. But the bullet had only been delayed. not avoided. Harvest came in early October. Robert rented the same combine as always. He worked slowly and carefully to minimize grain loss. Every bushel mattered this year. His final yield was 102 bushels per acre, 32,640 bushels total. He sold half immediately at $2.30 per bushel, the lowest price he had seen in 4 years. That sale brought in $37,536, not good, but survivable. His total revenue for the year would be $75,000. Costs were $42,000 because of the fungicide and higher fuel prices. Net, $33,000. He had made $33,000. He could live on that. He could save some of that. The farm would continue. No crisis, just a bad year that he absorbed and moved on from. James harvested 100 bushels per acre, 48,000 bushels. He sold 3/4 immediately at $2.30. That sale brought in $82,800. With the remaining quarter sold later, his total revenue would be $110,000. Costs, $73,000. The fungicide, the increased fuel, the repairs on equipment he had deferred, net before debt service, $37,000. Debt service, $37,200. He had operated an entire year, worked from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week, stressed and sweated and worried, and he had lost $200. He sat in his truck at the grain elevator after selling his last load and stared at the settlement check. The numbers blurred. This could not be happening. He had done everything right. He had farmed efficiently. He had used modern equipment. He had managed his inputs carefully. But the market did not care. The weather did not care. And the debt still came due whether he made money or not. That evening, he went to see Roger Whitman. The bank was closed, but Roger had said to come by anytime. James knocked on the back door of Roger's house. Roger answered in slippers and a cardigan sweater. "Come in." They sat in Roger's study, a room lined with books and hunting trophies, a deer head on the wall, photos of Roger with various civic leaders. "I need to restructure," James said. Roger poured them each 2 fingers of bourbon. He handed a glass to James. "Tell me what you are thinking." "I lost money this year." "Not much, but I lost. I cannot make my payments. I need to refinance and push some of this debt out longer." Roger sipped his bourbon. "I can do that. But it will cost you. Your interest rate will go up." "To what?" 10% on the portion we refinance." James felt the number like a punch. 10%. That would add $3,000 a year to his debt service. "I do not have a choice. You could sell some land, pay down debt. Land values are down. If I sell now, I will take a loss. Then you are stuck. You refinance at higher rates or you default." James drank the bourbon in one swallow. The burn in his throat was almost welcome. Something to focus on besides the crushing weight of the situation. "Refinance," Roger nodded. "Come in Monday. We will draw up the papers." James drove home in the dark. The headlights of his truck illuminated the gravel road. On both sides, harvested fields stretched away into blackness. Somewhere out there was Robert Sullivan's farm, 320 acres farmed with 1950s equipment, making money, sleeping well. James had thought he was smarter, more progressive, more successful. Now he realized he had just been lucky, and luck had run out. The winter of 1976 was brutal, not because of the weather was mild, but because of what was happening in the broader economy. The Federal Reserve, determined to crush inflation, continued raising interest rates. 9%, 10%, 11%. Each increase was like turning a screw in a vise. Farmers with variable rate debt felt the squeeze month by month. By January, James Carlson's debt service had climbed to $42,000 a year. $42,000. He would need to sell over 18,000 bushels just to cover debt. On 480 acres, that meant he needed almost 38 bushels per acre just to break even on debt payments. He sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning in February and tried to figure out how to make it work. Karen was at church with the kids. He had stayed home claiming he had a headache. But the truth was, he could not face Pastor David Miller, could not sit in a pew and pretend everything was fine, could not sing hymns about God's provision when he felt abandoned. The phone rang. He almost did not answer, but it might be important. He picked up. "James, this is Dutch Henderson." Dutch was one of the other farmers from the church group. He farmed 500 acres 3 miles west. "Hey, Dutch, what is up? I wanted to tell you before you heard it somewhere else. I am selling out." James sat down heavily. "What?" "I am done. I borrowed to expand in '74. Interest rates have killed me. I am upside down on my loans. The bank is going to foreclose anyway. I am selling to a corporate farm out of Des Moines while I can still get something. Dutch, I am sorry. Do not be sorry. Be careful. You are carrying debt too. If we have another bad year, you are going to be where I am. We will be fine. That is what I said last year. Then I lost $40,000. Now I am losing the farm my grandfather homesteaded. There was nothing to say to that. James offered platitudes, prayers, support, but they both knew it was empty. Dutch was losing everything and there was nothing anyone could do. After he hung up, James sat staring at the wall. Dutch was the first, but he would not be the last. All across the county, farmers who had borrowed to expand were realizing the math did not work anymore. High debt, high interest rates, low commodity prices. It was a combination that killed farms. Robert Sullivan heard about Dutch Henderson at church the following Sunday. The news spread through the congregation like a cold wind. Dutch had been farming for 30 years. His father had farmed the same land. His grandfather had broken it with horses. Now it was going to a corporation that would farm it with hired managers and computerized equipment. After the service, Robert found Dutch standing alone by his truck. The man looked 10 years older than he had 6 months ago. I heard, I am sorry. Dutch nodded. I should have listened to you. Should have stayed small. Should have been content with what I had. You did what you thought was right. I was greedy. That is what I was. I wanted to be big. Wanted to impress people. Now I have nothing. Robert did not know what to say. So he said nothing. He just stood there with his neighbor who was about to stop being his neighbor. Dutch looked at him with hollow eyes. You know what the worst part is? I did everything the experts told me to do. Borrowed when they said to borrow. Expanded when they said to expand. Used the best equipment. Followed the best practices. And I still lost. So what does that tell you about the system? It tells me the system is designed to benefit the banks, not the farmers. Dutch laughed bitterly. Took me losing everything to figure that out. You knew it all along. My grandfather taught me. He lost almost everything in the 30s. He made sure I understood. Well, I wish my grandfather had taught me the same lesson. They shook hands. Dutch drove away. Robert never saw him again. 6 weeks later, the corporate farm took possession. They bulldozed Dutch's house and machine shed. They installed a prefabricated metal building and brought in new equipment. They hired a 25-year-old farm manager who had an agronomy degree and no farming experience. It was efficient. It was modern. It was everything the agriculture industry said was the future. And it was soulless. Spring planting 1976 began under clouds. Not weather clouds, psychological clouds. The mood in the farming community had shifted. The optimism of 73 and 74 was gone, replaced by anxiety, by whispered conversations about who was in trouble, about which farms might not make it. Gary Peterson, who had borrowed heavily to buy that quarter section, was rumored to be 3 months behind on payments. Tom Drescher had sold all his equipment and was renting it back from the buyer. The banks were starting to get nervous. They were requiring more documentation, more financial statements, more proof that borrowers could actually repay. The lending spigot that had been wide open was now barely trickling. Robert planted his 320 acres same as always. He had saved enough from good years to replace his old planter with a slightly less old planter. A 1964 model he bought from an estate sale for $2,800 cash. It had 6 rows instead of 4. He could plant faster now, still not as fast as James with his modern equipment, but faster than before. James planted his 480 acres knowing this had to be a good year. He had no margin left, no cushion. If yields were down or prices dropped or anything went wrong, he would be in the same position as Dutch Henderson. The weight of that knowledge sat on his chest every morning when he woke up. It followed him into the fields. It kept him awake at night. May brought adequate rain. June was warm but not scorching. July looked promising. The corn was waist-high and healthy. For the first time in months, James felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this year would be okay. Maybe the crisis would pass him by. Then in early August, the rains came. Not gentle rains, torrential rains, 6 inches in 3 days. The fields flooded, water stood in the low spots, corn roots drowned, the surviving plants yellowed from lack of oxygen. Robert walked his fields in rubber boots, sloshing through standing water. Some areas were total losses. The corn was dead. Other areas were damaged but might recover. He estimated he had lost 15% of his crop to flooding. It hurt, but he would survive. Even with a 15% loss, he would make money this year. James walked his fields and felt despair settling into his bones. He had lost 20% of his crop, maybe more. The low areas where water had stood for days were completely gone. He would be lucky to average 95 bushels per acre. He went home and ran the numbers. 95 bushels times 480 acres, 45,600 bushels. At current futures prices of $2.15 per bushel, that was 98,000 gross. Cost would be at least 70,000. That left 28,000. Debt service was 42,000. He was going to lose $14,000, and there was nothing he could do about it. That night he told Karen. They sat at the kitchen table with the kids asleep upstairs. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked the question he had been dreading. What happens if we cannot pay? The bank forecloses. We lose the farm. Her face went pale. Can we sell something? Sell what? The equipment is worth less than we owe on it. The land values are down. If we sell, we will still owe money after the sale. So what do we do? James looked at his wife. 12 years of marriage. 2 children. A life built on the assumption that hard work and smart decisions would lead to prosperity. Now all of that was unraveling. I do not know. She reached across the table and took his hand. We will figure it out. But he could see the fear in her eyes. She was scared. So was he. Across the fence line, Robert Sullivan sat in his kitchen with Jack. They were reviewing the farm finances together. Jack was 19 now. He had finished 1 year at Iowa State studying accounting. He was home for the summer, helping with farm work. Robert had started teaching him the business side, how to read the ledgers, how to project yields and revenues, how to make decisions based on reality instead of hope. We will lose about 5,000 bushels to the flooding, Robert said. That is $11,000 in lost revenue at current prices. But we will still net around 40,000 this year. Not bad for a bad year, Jack said. That is the point, son. We can absorb bad years because we have no debt. If we owed money, this flood would be a crisis. For us, it is just a disappointment. What about Mr. Carlson? He got flooded too. Robert was quiet. He knew James was struggling. Everyone knew. It was a small community. Word spread. He is in trouble. Bad trouble? Yes. Jack looked out the window toward the Carlson place. He had grown up playing with Tyler Carlson. They had been friends. Now Tyler was 16 and working every spare hour on the farm. Jack had seen the stress in the whole family. Is there anything we can do? Robert shook his head. Not unless he asks, and he will not ask. Pride. That night, Robert did something he had not done in years. He knelt beside his bed and prayed. Not for himself, for James Carlson, for Karen and the kids, for all the farmers in the county who were drowning in debt and despair. He prayed that somehow, some way they would find a path through. But deep down, he knew that for many of them, there was no path. The decisions had been made. The debt had been taken on. The market had turned, and now the consequences had to be faced. Harvest, 1976, was a somber affair. Robert averaged 108 bushels per acre despite the flood damage. Some fields had done well, others poorly. It averaged out. He sold half his crop at $215. Revenue was lower than he had hoped, but he would clear $38,000. Enough to live on, enough to save some. James averaged 93 bushels per acre, his worst yield in 5 years. He sold 3/4 of it immediately because he needed cash. The check from the grain elevator was $74,000. With the remainder, total revenue would be $98,000. After costs and debt service, he lost $16,000. $16,000. He had to borrow from the bank to cover operating expenses. His total debt was now approaching $300,000. $300,000 on 480 acres that were now worth maybe $600,000. His debt-to-equity ratio was 50%. The bank was getting nervous. In November, Roger Whitman called James into his office. The meeting was not friendly. Roger had pressure from his board. Too many AG loans were going bad. They needed to reduce exposure. James, we need you to sell land, pay down debt, get your ratio back under 40%. I cannot sell at these prices. I would lose $100,000. Then you need to find another way to generate income, because I cannot carry you anymore. What are you saying? I am saying if you miss another payment, we start foreclosure proceedings. James walked out of the bank feeling like he had been punched. The sky was gray. Snow was starting to fall. Winter was coming, and he had no idea how he was going to survive it. That evening, he stood at the fence line where he had stood so many times before, where he had told Robert Sullivan to modernize, where he had bragged about his new equipment, where he had believed he was smarter than the old ways. Robert saw him and walked over. They stood on opposite sides of the fence. Two men who had chosen different paths, one path leading to stability, one leading to ruin. "You were right," James said. Robert said nothing. "I should have listened, should have stayed small, should have been afraid of debt. You were not wrong to want to grow. You were just unlucky with timing. Number one, I was stupid, and now I am going to lose everything." Robert looked at his neighbor, at the pain in his eyes, at the defeat in his posture. "Is there anything I can do?" James shook his head. "Unless you want to buy 480 acres of debt-laden farmland. If I could help, I would." "I know." They stood in silence as the snow fell harder, covering the fields, covering the mistakes, covering everything in white. But underneath the snow, the ground was frozen, hard, unforgiving, like the debt that would not go away, like the payments that would not stop, like the reality that could not be denied. The fence line stood between them. On one side, a man who had survived by doing nothing except refusing to borrow. On the other side, a man who had done everything the experts recommended and was being destroyed for it. Spring would come again. Planting would happen. Crops would grow. But for James Carlson, the question was whether he would still be there to see it, or whether the bank would take it all before another seed went into the ground. Winter turned to spring. Spring turned to another planting season. The cycle continued as it always did. The land did not care about debt. The soil did not care about interest rates. The seasons marched forward indifferent to the desperation of the men who worked the earth. But 1977 was different. Something had fundamentally changed in the agricultural economy. It was not just one thing, it was everything at once. A convergence of forces that would break the backs of farmers across the Midwest. In January, the Federal Reserve raised rates again, 12%. The announcement came on a Thursday. By Friday, every farmer with variable rate debt felt the impact. Payment schedules were recalculated. Letters went out from banks. The vice tightened another turn. James Carlson received his letter on a Monday morning in February. He opened it standing by his mailbox at the end of the driveway. The cold wind cut through his coat. His hands shook as he read the numbers. Effective March 1st, your monthly land payment will increase from $3,500 to $3,920. Annual payment, $47,040. He stood there holding the letter. Snow started to fall, light flakes at first, then heavier. The paper got wet in his hands. The ink started to run, but he kept staring at it. $47,000, plus his equipment payment of $13,000. Total debt service, $60,000 per year. $60,000. He would need to sell 27,900 bushels just to cover debt. On 480 acres, he needed to average 58 bushels per acre just to break even on payments. Not to make money, not to live, just to service debt. It was impossible. No one averaged 58 bushels to break even. That meant he would need to gross at least 130 bushels per acre to actually survive. And prices were still dropping. Corn was now trading at $2.05 per bushel. He walked back to the house moving like a man in a dream. Karen was in the kitchen making breakfast. Tyler and Amy were getting ready for school. A normal Monday morning, except nothing was normal anymore. Karen saw his face. "What is it?" He handed her the letter. She read it. Her face went pale. "Can we pay this?" "No." She sat down heavily. "So what do we do?" James had no answer. For the first time in his adult life, he had no plan. No solution. No way forward. That afternoon, he drove to the bank. Roger Whitman was with another client. James waited in the lobby for 40 minutes. The walls were covered with photos of farms the bank had financed. Happy farmers standing in front of new equipment. Smiling families at kitchen tables signing loan papers. All of it a lie. All of it bait for a trap. Roger finally called him back. They sat in his office. The same office where Roger had sold him the dream of expansion. The same desk where James had signed papers believing he was making smart decisions. "I got the letter," James said. "I know this is difficult." "Difficult? Roger, I cannot pay $60,000 a year. It is not possible." "Then we have a problem." James leaned forward. "I need you to refinance again. Push the payments out longer. Lower the monthly amount." Roger shook his head. "I cannot do that. Your debt-to-equity ratio is already at 60%. You are upside down on your equipment loans. The bank's board will not approve any more restructuring. Then what am I supposed to do? Roger folded his hands on the desk. You have three options. One, you sell enough land to pay down debt to a manageable level. Two, you find another source of income. Three, you default and we foreclose. If I sell land, I will lose $100,000 at current prices. That is your decision. What about option two? What other income? Do you have a wife who works? A job you can take in winter? Karen works part-time at the grocery store. She makes $6,000 a year. That is not enough. Then you are left with option three. James felt rage building in his chest. You are the one who talked me into this. You said land values would go up. You said it was safe. Roger's face hardened. I provided financing. You made the decision to borrow. No one forced you. You made it sound like I would be stupid not to. That is business, James. I'm sorry it did not work out. But the bank has to protect its interests. James stood up. If he stayed in that office another minute, he would do something he regretted. He walked out without another word. Drove home in a fog. When he got there, Karen was waiting. What did he say? He said, "We are on our own." She started to cry. Quietly at first, then harder. James held her in the kitchen while their children did homework in the next room. Held her while she sobbed into his shoulder. Held her while his own tears finally came. They had lost. The farm was gone. It was just a matter of time now. Robert Sullivan heard about James's situation from Pastor David Miller. The pastor stopped by one evening in March. They sat in Robert's kitchen drinking coffee. "I am worried about James Carlson," David said. "We all are. I went to see him last week. He is not doing well. Drinking, not sleeping. Karen is afraid he might do something desperate." Robert felt the weight of that statement. "Do you think he would hurt himself?" "I do not know, but I have seen it before. Farmers who lose everything. Some of them do not come back from it. What can I do?" "Talk to him. You are his neighbor. He respects you. He hates me. He thinks I was right and he was wrong. That is hard for a man to face. Then help him face it. Show him there is life after losing a farm." But Robert knew that was not true. Not for men like James, men who had defined themselves by their success, by their ambition, by their ability to build something bigger than what they inherited. Taking that away was like taking their identity. Still, he promised David he would try. The next Sunday, Robert waited by the fence line. He saw James come out of his house around noon. James walked across his field toward the boundary. When he reached the fence, he stopped. They stood there in silence for a long moment. The wind blew across the empty fields. Planting was still weeks away. The ground was brown and bare. Finally, James spoke. "I got a letter from the bank yesterday. They are starting foreclosure proceedings." Robert said nothing. "Auction is scheduled for September. 6 months from now. Everything goes. Land, equipment, everything." "I am sorry." "You should not be sorry. You should feel vindicated. You were right. I was wrong. The old way was better." Robert shook his head. "There is no old way or new way. There is just debt and no debt. I would have failed too if I had borrowed what you borrowed. But you did not borrow. That is the point. You had the discipline to say no. I did not. You were not undisciplined. You were optimistic. There is a difference." James laughed bitterly. Optimism cost $300,000 apparently. They stood in silence again. Robert wanted to help. But what could he do? He could not pay James's debt. Could not stop the foreclosure. Could not turn back time. "What will you do after?" Robert asked. "I do not know. Move, I guess. Find work somewhere. Karen wants to go back to her parents in Des Moines. Tyler can finish high school there. Amy will adjust." "And you?" James looked at him with empty eyes. "I will survive. That is what men do. We survive." But Robert saw something in his neighbor's face that scared him. A flatness. An absence of hope. The look of a man who had already died inside and was just waiting for his body to catch up. "James, I want you to know something. You are a good farmer, a good man. This does not change that. It changes everything. No, it changes your circumstances, not who you are." James did not respond. He turned and walked back toward his house. Robert watched him go, and for the first time, he wondered if James would make it to the auction, or if something would happen before then. Spring planting came. Robert planted his 320 acres. James planted his 480 for what he knew would be the last time. It felt like a funeral. Every pass across the field was another goodbye. This soil that his father had farmed, that his grandfather had broken with horses, all of it about to belong to someone else. But he planted anyway, because that is what farmers do, even when they know it is pointless. even when they know they will not harvest what they plant. They put seed in the ground because not doing so would be admitting complete defeat. May brought good rains. June was warm. By July, both farms had excellent crops. The corn was tall and healthy. The best stand James had seen in years, and it meant nothing, because he would not be the one to harvest it. In early August, something happened that made everything worse. The bank sold James's debt. He received a letter from a company called Midwest Asset Recovery. They had purchased his loan from First National Bank for $240,000. James owed $320,000. The bank had taken an $80,000 loss to get the loan off their books. Midwest Asset Recovery was a debt collection company. They specialized in buying distressed agricultural loans at a discount, then foreclosing and selling the assets at market value. The difference was their profit. The letter was cold, clinical. It informed James that all communication regarding his debt should now be directed to their offices in Omaha, that the foreclosure proceedings would continue as scheduled, that they expected full cooperation during the asset liquidation process. James called the number on the letter. A woman answered, professional but distant. I want to discuss payment options. There are no payment options. The loan is in default. The foreclosure is proceeding. But I have a crop in the field. If you let me harvest it, I can make a payment. The crop is part of the collateral. It will be sold at auction along with everything else. That is my year of work, my seed and fertilizer and labor. That is how foreclosure works, Mr. Carlson. I am sorry. She did not sound sorry. James hung up. He sat at his kitchen table staring at nothing. Karen was at work. The kids were at summer jobs. He was alone in the house with the crushing realization that he had no control, no options, no hope. He went to the cabinet above the refrigerator and took down a bottle of whiskey. He had been drinking more lately, not drunk, just enough to numb the edges, to make sleep possible, to quiet the voice in his head that kept asking how he had failed so completely. He poured 3 fingers into a glass, drank it, poured 3 more. By the time Karen came home, he was drunk, sitting in the living room in the dark. She turned on the light and saw him. James. He looked at her with unfocused eyes. They sold my debt to a collection company. She sat down next to him. What does that mean? It means they are going to take everything. The crop, the equipment, the land, everything. She took the glass from his hand. We will get through this. How? How do we get through losing everything? We start over. People do it all the time. I am 44 years old. I have 2 kids, no money, no prospects. How do I start over? She did not have an answer. So she just held him, let him cry into her shoulder for the second time in 6 months, let him fall apart because there was nothing else to do. The summer passed in a haze. James went through the motions. He sprayed for bugs. He walked the fields. He did the maintenance that needed doing. But his heart was not in it. He was a ghost farming ground that no longer belonged to him. Tyler, his oldest son, saw what was happening, saw his father deteriorating. The boy was 16 now, old enough to understand, old enough to feel the weight of what was coming. One evening in late August, Tyler found his father in the machine shed. James was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, a bottle next to him. Bottle. Dad, you okay? James looked at his son, this boy who looked like him, who had his ambition, his drive. No, son, I am not okay. Tyler sat down next to him. Is it really over? Yeah, it is really over. What are we going to do? We are going to move to Des Moines. Your mom has family there. I will find work. You will finish school. Life will go on. But not here. Not here. Tyler was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that broke what was left of his father's heart. I hate farming. I never want to do this again. James closed his eyes. Good. That is good. You should hate it. It takes everything and gives nothing back. They sat in the machine shed until dark. Father and son, neither speaking, just existing in the wreckage of dreams that had died. September came. The corn was ready for harvest, but James would not be the one to harvest it. Midwest Asset Recovery had hired a custom harvesting crew. They would bring in the crop and sell it. James was not allowed to touch it. He stood at the edge of his field and watched strangers harvest corn he had planted, watched them load it into trucks and haul it away. Every bushel represented hours of his labor, his investment, his hope, and he got nothing from it. The auction was scheduled for September 23rd, a Saturday. The auctioneers came a week early to inventory everything. They walked through the machine shed with clipboards, took photos of the John Deere 4430, the planter, the truck, the tools, every piece of equipment James had bought believing it would help him succeed. They put up signs along the road, big yellow signs with red letters. Farm auction, equipment, land, terms, cash. People drove by slowly, looking. Some of them were neighbors. Some were strangers. All of them were vultures waiting to pick at the corpse of his failure. Robert Sullivan saw the signs go up. He felt sick. This was really happening. James was really losing everything. He went to see Pastor David. "I want to help, but I do not know how." David was quiet for a moment. You could buy some of his equipment, pay more than market value, give him something to start over with. Robert nodded slowly. "I could do that." On the morning of the auction, Robert woke early. He ate breakfast with Jack. His son was 20 now, home from college for the weekend. He had wanted to come, to support Robert, to witness what happened when debt destroyed a farm. They drove to the Carlson place at 9. Cars already lined the road, trucks filled the driveway. 200 people at least. Some were farmers looking for deals. Some were curious neighbors. Some were just there to watch. James stood off to the side with Karen and the kids. They looked like they were attending a funeral. Solemn, grief-stricken, destroyed. The auctioneer was a large man with a loud voice. He stood on a platform truck with a microphone, started with the equipment. "First up, folks, we have a 1972 John Deere 4430 tractor, 4,800 hours, recent transmission rebuild. This is a quality machine. Let us start the bidding at $40,000. Silence. 35,000. A hand went up in the crowd. 35,000. I have 35. Do I hear 40? Another hand. 40,000. I have 40. Do I hear 45? Robert raised his hand. 45,000 from the gentleman in the red cap. Do I hear 50? The bidding continued. Robert kept raising his hand. He knew the tractor was worth maybe 35,000 in current market conditions, but he did not care. He bid it up to $52,000. Won it. James saw what Robert was doing. Tears ran down his face. The planter went next. Robert bought it for $8,000, $3,000 more than market value. Then the land, 360 acres. The auctioneer described it in glowing terms. Prime farmland, good drainage, excellent production history. Let us start the bidding at $600,000. Silence. 550? Nothing. 500? Finally a hand went up. A man in a suit, corporate buyer. He bid 500,000. No one else bid against him. The land that James had bought for $800,000 sold for $500,000. After the sale, after the fees and commissions, Midwest Asset Recovery recovered their $240,000. The excess went to pay other creditors. James got nothing. When the auction ended, Robert walked over to where James stood. He handed him a check. "What is this?" "I overpaid for your equipment. This is the difference, $20,000. James looked at the check, $20,000. It would not change his situation, would not save the farm, but it was something, a small mercy in the midst of catastrophe. "I cannot take this." "Yes, you can. Use it to start over." James folded the check, put it in his pocket. "Thank you." They shook hands. Two men who had stood at that fence line so many times, who had chosen different paths, who had arrived at such different destinations. "I'm sorry it ended this way," Robert said. James nodded. "Me too." People started to leave. Trucks pulled out, hauling away equipment. The corporate buyers' representatives walked the land with surveying equipment. By sunset, it was over. The Carlson farm no longer existed. James and his family loaded their belongings into a U-Haul truck the next morning. Not much, just furniture and clothes and personal items. Everything else had been sold. Robert and Jack came over to help. They carried boxes, loaded furniture, worked in silence because there was nothing to say. When the truck was full, Karen got in with Amy. Tyler rode with his father. They would drive to Des Moines, to Karen's parents' house, to start over. James stood in the driveway one last time, looked at the fields he had planted, the house where his children had grown up, the machine shed where he had kept his dreams. Then he got in the truck and drove away. Robert and Jack watched them go, watched until the truck disappeared around the curve in the road. Jack spoke first. "That could have been us." Robert nodded. "That is why we never borrowed." They walked back to their own farm, 320 acres, paid for, free and clear, not big, not impressive, but theirs, completely theirs. That night, Robert sat at his kitchen table with the ledger. He turned to a new page, wrote the date, September 24th, 1979. Below that, he wrote, Today, James Carlson lost his farm. Good man, good farmer. Destroyed by debt he could not control. The bank sold his loan to a collection company that foreclosed without mercy. They made profit on his suffering. He walked away with nothing after 20 years of work. I helped him with $20,000. It is not enough. Nothing would be enough. But it is what I could do. Jack asked me today if it could have been us. The answer is yes. If I had borrowed what James borrowed, we would be the ones loading a U-Haul truck. The only difference between us was that I said no when he said yes. I am not smarter. I am not better. I was just more afraid. And sometimes fear is wisdom. He closed the ledger, went to bed, but sleep did not come easy. He kept seeing James's face at the auction, the emptiness, the defeat. Robert had survived. But survival felt hollow when it came at the cost of watching your neighbor destroyed. Across the fence line, the land that had belonged to the Carlson family for 3 generations now belonged to Agricorp Enterprises. They would farm it with hired managers, with corporate efficiency, with no connection to the soil or the history or the families who had broken this ground. The fence line remained, but everything on one side of it had changed. A family farm had died, and nothing would ever bring it back. In Des Moines, James Carlson lay awake in his in-laws' guest room. Karen slept beside him. Down the hall, his children tried to adjust to new rooms, new lives, new reality. He thought about the farm, about the tractor he had been so proud of, about the expansion that was supposed to make him successful, about all the decisions that had seemed so smart at the time. Roger Whitman had told him debt was a tool, but debt was not a tool, debt was a chain. And he had wrapped that chain around his own neck and handed the other end to the bank. Now the chain had been pulled tight, and he had strangled on it. He wondered if he would ever farm again, if he would ever feel soil between his fingers, if he would ever watch corn grow tall and know it belonged to him. The answer was no. He knew that. This was not a setback. This was an ending. At 44 years old, James Carlson had lost everything he had worked for, everything his father had built, everything his grandfather had started. And the worst part, the part that would haunt him for the rest of his life, was that Robert Sullivan had tried to warn him, had stood at that fence line and told him that debt was dangerous, that the good times would not last. But James had not listened. He had been too confident, too certain, too blind, and now he paid the price. Outside the window of that guest room, Des Moines stretched out in the darkness. Miles of concrete and streetlights, no fields, no soil, no horizon broken only by corn. James closed his eyes. He did not pray. He had stopped praying months ago. God had not answered his prayers. Or maybe God had answered and the answer was no. Either way, the result was the same. He had lost. 5 years passed, then 10, then 20. The world kept turning, the seasons cycled, and the farm crisis of the 1980s became history. Something that had happened, something people remembered if they had lived through it, something forgotten by those who had not. But the scars remained. Across Iowa, across Nebraska and Kansas and the Dakotas, empty farmhouses with broken windows, machine sheds collapsing under the weight of snow, land that had been in families for 100 years, now owned by corporations with offices in Chicago and New York. The statistics told the story in cold numbers. Between 1978 and 1985, 235,000 family farms failed. 235,000. Each one a story like James Carlson's, each one a family destroyed by debt they could not control. But some farms survived. The ones with no debt, the ones whose owners had been too cautious or too afraid or too stubborn to borrow. Men like Robert Sullivan, men who had been mocked for being backward, who had been told they were missing opportunities, who had been called fools. Those men were still farming when the dust settled. Robert Sullivan turned 60 in 1989. His son Jack was 25, graduated from Iowa State with a degree in agricultural economics. He had seen what happened in the farm crisis, had studied it, had written his senior thesis on debt to equity ratios and farm survival rates. His conclusion was simple. Farms with debt to equity ratios above 40% in 1980 had a 92% failure rate. Farms with ratios below 20% had an 88% survival rate. The difference was debt. Nothing else mattered as much. Jack came home to farm with his father. Not because he had to. He had job offers from John Deere and from the Iowa Department of Agriculture. Good jobs with good salaries. But he wanted to farm, wanted to continue what his great-great-grandfather had started. Father and son sat at the kitchen table one evening in May, the same table where Robert had sat with his own father, where 3 generations of Sullivans had made decisions about the land. Jack had a proposal. Dad, I want to buy 160 acres. Robert looked at his son. With what money? I have 40,000 saved. I can get a loan for the rest. Robert felt something tighten in his chest. How much would you borrow? 160,000. The land I am looking at is selling for 200,000. I put down 40. Borrow the rest. And your payment? About 14,000 a year. But Dad, I ran the numbers. 160 acres averaging 120 bushels at current prices. Nets 38,000 after costs. I can cover the payment and still make money. Robert was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. Do you remember what happened to James Carlson? Of course. Do you remember why? He borrowed too much. He borrowed what seemed reasonable at the time. The payment seemed manageable. Then interest rates went up. Prices went down. Weather did not cooperate. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Jack leaned forward. But that was different. The rates were variable. I can get a fixed rate, and I am only borrowing 80%. Carlson was at 95%. My debt to equity will be 40%. That is the safe zone. Robert shook his head slowly. There is no safe zone with debt, son. There is only debt and no debt. I know you studied this. I know you think you can manage it, but I am asking you not to do it. Why not? Because I do not want to watch you lose everything like I watched James lose everything. Jack sat back. He had expected resistance, but not this much. So what should I do? Just farm your 320 acres? Never expand? Farm the 320 until I die. Then it is yours, free and clear. Then if you want to expand, you use the profits to buy more land. Cash, no debt. That could take 20 years. So it takes 20 years. You will be 45. You will own 480 acres with no debt. That is better than owning 800 with debt you can never pay off. But what if land prices keep going up? I will never be able to afford it. Then you farm what you have. Son, this is not about how much land you own. It is about whether you own the land or the bank owns you. They argued for 2 hours. Jack made his case, showed his spreadsheets, his projections, his analysis of risk. Robert listened, acknowledged that Jack's math was sound, but refused to change his mind. Finally, Jack said the thing that ended the conversation. This is my decision. I am 25 years old. I do not need your permission. You are right, you do not need my permission. But if you borrow money, you do it without my blessing. Jack stood up, angry, frustrated, feeling like his father did not trust him. Fine, he walked out, drove to town, sat in his truck in the parking lot of the Farm Credit Office for 30 minutes. Then he drove home. He did not buy the land, not because his father forbade it, but because he realized something sitting in that parking lot. His father had earned the right to be heard, had survived when others failed, had wisdom born of watching neighbors destroyed. Maybe Jack's math was better. Maybe his risk assessment was more sophisticated. But Robert's fear was based on reality, on seeing what debt did to people. Jack decided to trust the fear more than the math. He never told his father about that decision. Just stopped talking about buying land. Focused on farming the 320 acres. Learning, saving money. And Robert never asked, just watched his son with quiet pride, knowing Jack had chosen wisdom over ambition. In Des Moines, James Carlson was learning how to live a different life. He had found work as a forklift operator at a warehouse. It paid $12 an hour, 40 hours a week, sometimes overtime. It was honest work, physical work, but it was not farming. He came home every evening with a sore back and calloused hands. Karen had gotten a full-time job as a receptionist at a dental office. Between them, they made enough. Not much, but enough. They rented a small house in a neighborhood where all the houses looked the same, where no one knew their story, where James was just another working man trying to get on. Tyler had graduated high school, gone to trade school, become an electrician, good money, steady work. He had kept his promise, never farmed, never wanted to. The memory of losing the farm had poisoned that dream forever. Amy was in college, studying nursing. She would graduate next year, start a career helping people. She had been 12 when they lost the farm, old enough to remember, old enough to carry scars. James was 50 years old now. 6 years since the auction. 6 years since he had driven that U-Haul truck away from the only life he had ever known. Some days it felt like a lifetime ago. Other days it felt like yesterday. He still thought about the farm every day. Wondered who was farming his land, what the crops looked like, whether the fence line was still there, whether Robert Sullivan still stood there on Sunday mornings looking out over the fields. He had not gone back, could not bear to see it, could not face Robert. The shame was too deep. But on a Saturday morning in October 1985, his phone rang. It was Pastor David Miller. "James, it has been a long time." "Pastor, how are you?" "I am well. Listen, I know this is difficult, but I wanted to tell you something. Robert Sullivan had a heart attack 3 days ago." James felt the room tilt. "Is he okay?" "He is alive. But it was serious. He is in the hospital in Iowa City. I thought you would want to know." "Thank you for telling me." "James, I know you have not been back, but Robert asked about you. He wants to see you." That evening, James drove to Iowa City, an hour and a half in his old pickup truck. Karen came with him. They did not talk much, just drove through the darkness toward the hospital. Robert was in a room on the 4th floor. Jack was there. So was Pastor David. They stepped out when James and Karen arrived. James walked to the bedside. Robert looked old, thin, gray. The heart attack had aged him 10 years in 3 days. But when he saw James, he smiled. "You came." "Of course I came." Robert gestured to the chair. James sat. Karen stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder. "I wanted to see you," Robert said. "Wanted to tell you something." "You do not need to tell me anything. Just rest." "Number one, I need to say this. I have been thinking about it for 6 years." Robert took a slow breath. "I am sorry." James looked confused. "For what?" "For not trying harder to stop you. I saw what was going to happen. I knew the debt would destroy you. And I said nothing. I was too proud, too wrapped up in being right. You tried to warn me. I did not listen. I should have tried harder. Should have been a better friend." James felt tears coming. "You were the best friend I had. You gave me $20,000 when I had nothing. You did not have to do that. It was not enough. I should have done more. There was nothing more you could do. I made my choices. I live with them." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Robert spoke again. "Are you farming?" "Number one, I work in a warehouse." "Do you miss it?" "Every day." Robert nodded. "When I get out of here, if I get out of here, I want you to come work for me. Help Jack run the farm. I will pay you whatever the warehouse pays, plus a share of profits." James shook his head. "I cannot take charity. It is not charity. I need help. Jack cannot do it alone. And you are the best farmer I know." "I lost everything." "You lost your farm. You did not lose your knowledge. You did not lose your skill. Those things do not go away because the bank foreclosed." James looked at Karen. She nodded. "Think about it," Robert said. "No pressure, but the offer stands." 2 months later, James Carlson moved back to Riverside, not to his old farm. That was still owned by Agricorp, but to a small house on the edge of town, within walking distance of Robert Sullivan's place. He started working the farm in January 1986. At first it was awkward. He felt like a failure working for the man who had succeeded where he had failed. But Robert never made him feel that way, never lorded his success over James, just treated him as a partner. They farmed the 320 acres together. Robert handled the planning and financing. Jack managed the day-to-day operations. James did the physical work, ran the equipment, made sure everything got done. It was not what James had imagined his life would be, working someone else's land, taking orders from a man 20 years younger. But it was farming, and farming was what he knew, what he loved, what he could not live without. The first year they netted $42,000. Robert split it 3 ways, $14,000 each. James took his share and put $10,000 in the bank. Saved it. For what, he did not know. But he saved it anyway. The second year they netted $51,000. The third year, $48,000. It averaged out. Good years and bad years. But always profitable because there was no debt. James watched how they operated. No borrowing, no expansion for the sake of expansion. When they needed equipment, they saved until they could pay keep. When a piece of ground came up for sale, they evaluated whether they could afford it without debt. Usually they could not, so they passed. It was the opposite of everything James had believed when he was farming his own place. Then he had thought growth was mandatory, that standing still was falling behind, that debt was a tool to accelerate success. Now he understood that growth could kill you, that standing still was sometimes the smartest move. That debt was not a tool, it was a trap. By 1990, James had saved $60,000. He was 55 years old. He would never own a farm again. He knew that, but he had something more valuable. He had peace, no payments hanging over him, no fear of the mail, no sleepless nights running numbers that did not add up. One evening in November, he stood at the old fence line, the boundary between Robert's farm and what had been his. Agricorp had torn down his house and machine shed years ago, put up a big metal building. The land was farmed by a manager who lived in town and drove out in a company truck. Jack came out and stood next to him. "You okay?" Just remembering what it used to be like. "Yeah." Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised James. "My dad talks about you all the time. Says you are the reason I do not borrow money." "How so?" "He says I need to remember what debt did to you, so I never forget what is at stake." "Does that bother you, being used as a cautionary tale?" James smiled. "Number. If my failure keeps you from making the same mistakes, then it means something. Then I did not lose everything for nothing." They stood there as the sun set. Two men separated by age and circumstance, but connected by farming, by loss, by the hard lessons that only come through suffering. Years passed. Robert recovered from his heart attack, lived another 15 years, farmed until he was 78, then turned the operation over to Jack completely. Moved into town, spent his days reading and woodworking and playing checkers at the senior center. He died in 2004 at the age of 78, quietly, in his sleep, the way he had lived, without drama, without fuss. His funeral was held at Riverside Methodist, the same church where he had sat in the same pew for 60 years. 200 people attended. Farmers, neighbors, people whose lives he had touched in small ways over 8 decades. Jack gave the eulogy, talked about his father's discipline, his wisdom, his refusal to do what everyone else was doing, his willingness to be mocked for being cautious, his survival when others failed. At the end, Jack said something that made James cry. "My father was not a great farmer. He did not farm the most acres, did not have the newest equipment, did not make the most money. But he died owning every inch of ground he farmed, owing nothing to any man, free in a way most people never are. And that, more than anything else, is what he taught me. That freedom is worth more than growth. That peace is worth more than profit. That survival is better than ambition." After the funeral, James and Jack stood in the cemetery. Robert's grave was next to his wife Margaret's, next to his father's and grandfather's. 4 generations of Sullivans in the same plot. "Your dad was a good man," James said. "The best. I would not have made it without him. After I lost the farm, if he had not given me work, I do not know what I would have done. He knew that. That is why he did it." They walked back to their trucks. James was 70 now, still working the farm part-time, still strong enough to drive a tractor, still useful. Jack was 40, running the farm his great-great-grandfather had homesteaded, 480 acres now. He had bought 160 acres 5 years ago, paid cash, saved for 12 years to do it. He farmed with a mix of old and new equipment, still had his grandfather's Farmall M in the shed, restored it, kept it running, not for nostalgia, but as a reminder of where they had come from, of what had been sacrificed to get here. The years continued their march. James turned 80 in 2015. His body had worn out from decades of physical labor, but his mind was sharp. He still remembered every detail of losing the farm, still thought about it. Tyler, his son, had become a successful electrical contractor, owned his own business, made good money, never farmed, never wanted to. But Tyler's one, James's grandson, that boy was different. His name was David, named after Pastor David Miller, who had died 10 years earlier. David was 20 years old, in college studying agronomy, and he wanted to farm. He came to visit his grandfather one Saturday in June. They sat on the porch of James's small house in Riverside, the same house he had moved into 30 years earlier when Robert gave him work. "Grandpa, I want to ask you something." David poured them both iced tea. "What is it?" "I want to buy land, start farming. But Dad says I should not. Says I should get a job with the extension service or a seed company. He says farming killed you." James was quiet for a long moment. "Your dad is not wrong. Farming did kill me in a way. I lost everything. My farm, my pride, almost lost my family. So you think I should not do it?" "I did not say that. I said your dad is not wrong, but he is not completely right either." David looked confused. James leaned forward. "Let me tell you something. The farm did not kill me. Debt killed me. I could have farmed forever if I had not borrowed money. But I borrowed, and when things went bad, I could not recover. So if I farm, I should not borrow. If you farm, you should never borrow more than you can pay back in one bad year. You should save until you can pay cash. You should be so conservative that people think you are foolish, and you should be okay with being small. David nodded slowly. There is something else, James said. Something I want to give you. He went inside, came back with an envelope, handed it to David. What is this? Open it. David opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $60,000. Grandpa, I cannot take this. Yes, you can. That is 30 years of saving, every penny I could spare. I have been waiting for someone in our family to want to farm again. That is you. But this is your money. It is your start. Use it as a down payment on land or to buy equipment, whatever you need, but promise me two things. Anything. First, never borrow more than 50% of what something is worth. Always have equity. Always have a cushion. Okay. Second, if someone offers you advice about borrowing money, about expanding, about getting bigger, you go visit the farm that used to be mine. Look at that metal building where my house used to be. Remember that a corporation owns land my grandfather broke with horses. Remember what debt can take from you. Can you promise me that? David's eyes were wet. I promise. They sat in silence for a while. Then David asked the question James had been waiting for. Do you regret it? Farming, after everything that happened? James looked out at the horizon, at fields of corn stretching away to meet the sky, at the land that defined this part of the world. Number one, I do not regret farming. I regret my decisions. I regret borrowing. I regret not listening to Robert Sullivan. But I do not regret the farming itself. It is in my blood, in our blood. And if you do it right, if you do it carefully, it can be the best life there is. David took the check, folded it carefully, put it in his wallet. Thank you, Grandpa. Make me proud. 4 years later, in 2019, David bought 160 acres. He put down 60,000, borrowed 40,000, paid it off in 3 years. Then he bought another 80 acres, cash, no debt. He farmed conservatively, saved aggressively, refused to expand beyond what he could manage without borrowing. And when people asked him why he did not get bigger, he told them about his grandfather, about losing the farm, about debt destroying 3 generations of work in 18 months. Some people understood. Some thought he was being foolish. But David did not care. He had promised his grandfather. And he was going to keep that promise. James Carlson died in 2021 at the age of 86. He died in the same small house where he had lived for 35 years. Karen was with him. So was Tyler and David. His last words were to David. You doing it right? Yes, Grandpa. No debt? No debt. Good boy. He closed his eyes and he was gone. At his funeral, Tyler spoke, talked about his father's failures and his redemption, about losing everything and finding peace, about the difference between success and survival. David spoke too, talked about the lessons his grandfather had taught him, about the check that had started his farming career, about the promise he had made. And Jack Sullivan spoke, 65 years old now, still farming, still debt-free. He talked about the fence line, about 2 men who had stood there 50 years ago making different choices, about how one choice led to destruction and one to survival. But the most important thing Jack said was this: James Carlson did not die a failure. He died a teacher, because his pain taught a new generation what his success never could have taught. That debt is dangerous. That caution is wisdom. That small and free is better than big and enslaved. After the funeral, David went to visit the old farm, the one his grandfather had lost. Agricorp still owned it, still farmed it with hired managers. The metal building still stood where his great-great-grandfather's house had been. He walked to the fence line, the same fence line where James and Robert had stood so many times. And he made a vow. He would never let debt take what he was building. He would farm carefully, live modestly, save aggressively. And when he died, he would pass land to his children that was free and clear. That belonged to them, not to a bank, not to a corporation, to them. That was the legacy his grandfather had given him. Not land, not equipment, but wisdom. The wisdom that comes from failure. The wisdom that saves the next generation. In the summer of 2024, a journalist came to Riverside. Her name was Helen Rodriguez. She was writing a story about the farm crisis of the 1980s, 40 years later, a retrospective. She interviewed Jack Sullivan, 68 years old, still sharp, still living in the farmhouse where his great-great-grandfather had settled. She asked him the question everyone asked: how did you survive when so many others failed? Jack thought about it, Then he gave the answer his father would have given. I did not do anything special. I just did not borrow money. That is it? That is the secret? That is it. I farmed small, lived modestly, saved what I could, and when the crisis hit, I had no debt. So I survived. Do you think the lessons from that time are still relevant? More than ever. I see young farmers today taking on massive debt, buying million-dollar equipment, borrowing against land values that could drop tomorrow. And I think you have not learned anything. The same trap is still there, just with bigger numbers. What would you tell them? I would tell them to go visit a farm auction, watch a family lose everything, see the pain, then ask themselves if growth is worth that risk. Helen wrote her article, published it in the Des Moines Register. It went viral. Millions of people read it, shared it, debated it. Some people said Jack was right, that debt was too dangerous, that farmers should be more conservative. Others said he was wrong, that farming required leverage, that you could not compete without borrowing. The debate raged, but Jack did not care. He had said what he believed, what his father had taught him, what Robert Sullivan had proven through 8 decades of farming. That summer, David invited Jack to visit his farm, 160 acres, free and clear, another 80 acres, free and clear, modest equipment, older but functional, profits averaging $40,000 a year. They stood at the edge of a cornfield. The crop was tall and healthy, the kind of stand that makes a farmer grateful. Your grandfather would be proud, Jack said. I hope so. He is. Wherever he is proud. They walked back to the truck. Jack was 68 years old. He moved slowly, but he moved. Can I ask you something, David said. Sure. Do you ever regret it? Not expanding, not getting bigger? Jack smiled. Every time I see a farm auction, I thank God I stayed small. Every time I hear about a farmer losing his farm to the bank, I sleep a little better knowing that will never be me. So no, I do not regret it, not even a little bit. They drove back to town, past fields that had been farmed for 150 years, past land that had seen generations of families come and go, past the fence line where Robert Sullivan and James Carlson had stood so many times. That fence line was gone now. AgriCorp had torn it out to make a bigger field, more efficient, more modern. But in memory, in the stories passed from grandfather to grandson, that fence line remained. A boundary between two philosophies, two approaches to life, two different answers to the same question. How much is enough? Robert Sullivan had answered, enough is what you can own without owing. James Carlson had answered, enough is always more than what you have. One answer led to peace, one led to destruction. And 40 years later, the lesson remained the same. Debt is not a tool, debt is a chain, and the only freedom worth having is the freedom that comes from owing nothing to anyone. The Sullivan farm still operates today. 160 acres farmed by Jack's nephew, the Farm All M sits in a museum in Des Moines, a reminder of a different time, when farming was smaller, simpler, harder, but somehow more honest. David farms his 240 acres, makes a good living, sleeps well, answers to no one. And somewhere in whatever comes after this life, Robert Sullivan and James Carlson stand at a fence line one more time. Not divided now, not separated by choices made 50 years ago. Just two farmers, two men who learned the same lesson in different ways. That the measure of a life is not how much you accumulate, but how much you have left when the storms come. And that the greatest wealth is not what you own, but what you owe, or rather, what you do not owe. The land remains. The seasons turn, and the lessons, hard-bought and paid for in suffering, get passed down to those willing to learn. That is the legacy. That is what survives. Not the farms that were lost, but the wisdom that was gained. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough.